Hi, my name is Donnie Brooks, and I serve as the Director of Athletics at McAllister College in St. Paul, Minnesota. Welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast. I see myself as a bricklayer and bridge builder, paving a way towards success for the programs and people I serve. My leadership philosophy was initially developed as an intern through the NCAA's Division III Ethnic Minority and Women's Internship Program. My philosophy was strengthened while serving in my role created through the NCAA Matching Grant. My most transformational leadership experience was the NCAA's Leadership Institute when I was surrounded by and challenged by the industry's most extraordinary emerging leaders, many who you've heard on this podcast. If you're looking for opportunities to level up, or maybe you've identified a future star that you'd like to invest in, my hope is that you'll look no further than our association and its extraordinary division of leadership development, whose purpose is the most important: developing the nation's future leaders. Please enjoy today's episode.
Greetings, this is Ty Brown, and welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast, where we highlight executive and organizational leadership. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at 1Q Leadership. Our guest today is Dr. Charles Small. Charles is the Director of Athletics at Valparaiso University. Greetings, Charles. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Excited to have you on now. There at Valpo, you're going into year 2, right?
Yeah.
Right? You get a year under your belt. You've done the proverbial listening tour. You've gotten to know all the campus constituents, and now it's like, okay, so now what are we going to do? What are we executing on here? So into that phase, I guess you probably already actually started executing on a lot, knowing you in terms of being an overachiever. College athletics, almost 20 years, 17, I believe, to be exact. Stops at Pitt, New Orleans, Arkansas, Iowa State, just before getting that position as athletic director there at Valpo. The reason why I have you on is what I know about you is you studied social work. I guess at Pitt, one of your degrees is social work.
Definitely.
And what I find interesting about social work is that I feel like it can apply to a lot of things we do in different industries, but specifically here in college athletics or higher education.
Definitely.
I know you're working at an institution where the president wants to designate it as a Hispanic serving institution, right? The institution also is a faith-based institution, I believe Lutheran in terms of Christianity. And there's a number of things that I think address specific communities when you talk about social work on a higher education campus. What I'd like to do is read this definition of social work, and you tell me if it fits in with what you study so we can have a basis for the language we're speaking in this conversation.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I have here is social work is an academic discipline and practice-based profession concerned with meeting the basic needs of individuals, families, groups, communities, and society as a whole to enhance their individual and collective well-being. Does that fit in terms of?
Absolutely. And so, Ty, when I commend you for covering this topic, I have a social work background, and I do think that training, is transferable into so many different settings. And so, like you said, at its basic level, you're looking at well-being of different populations, different groups, and really it goes into how do those systems function in society. And
Right.
so, for me, as I progressed through the college athletics industry and as I progressed as an administrator in higher education, those fundamentals and those concepts still hold true.
Okay.
I remember uh, studying social work, especially in some of your intro level classes. They tell you it's all about PI, so person and environment, right? So
Okay.
you have to understand the person and the environment that they're in. And it's all about understanding systems. So we are all subsystems within a greater system.
Right.
And so when I think about higher education, that gives me a lens in which, I look at how the athletic department is situated in the greater ecosystem of the institution, the university. But within all of that, the university is still within a community. And so you have those different levels and those different systems at play that all have different needs. And so I agree that social work really gives you this kind of lens to approach functioning of these different groups within different settings.
Yeah. So let's look at subgroups, right? You think
Hmm.
about a college campus, right? One subgroup in terms of students are students, right?
Yeah.
And then you can break the students into different backgrounds. You talk about where they've come from. You talk about ethnicities, what they're studying. Specifically in our industry, you talk about college athletics. There's student athletes, right? But then you can break the student athletes into specific sport. You can break them into ethnicity. It's just there's so many different subgroups when you talk about a college campus. One question I will ask about your background is I look at people who study social work, similar to the way I look at people who are teachers. There's a inherent care for people within that environment. Is there something in your background that led you down the path of studying social work? I don't know how much if you've had the chance to apply social work in terms of being a social worker because you've been in athletics, but I know you probably have applied some of the
Yeah.
concepts. But just think about your personal background. Is there something that led you to, social work as
Oh,
a field of
definitely,
study?
definitely. I've been so fortunate. I think I've found a great mix of just purpose and passion, but also
Mm.
kind of skill set and interest. So I came from a family of social workers, and so I had my mother, my aunts. They were in the schools, and also in communities as social workers. My dad worked with males and young with youth in the social work setting, and he was an administrator in at a boys' home, and so I was able to connect my passion with sport to once again, how do you a big value in social work, professional value is empowerment. So how do you utilize sport to empower different populations, and that's kind of my path. So I was introduced to it there. When I was in undergrad as a student athlete, thought I was going to work in the NBA for NBA Cares. I was going to use
Yeah,
basketball to go around the world and
yeah,
just make an impact. And did an internship with our athletic department and realized, hey, I really want to work with this college student population. And so that's how I got into it. But yeah, family was exposed to it early. And like I said, when you find that intersection of passion and purpose and value needed in society, I think you can do some really good things professionally.
yeah. It's interesting. I look at it. I have a definition of social workers, and you talk about a professional who aims to enhance the overall well-being and help meet basic and complex needs of communities of people, right? Communities and people. The president, the Hispanic Serving Institution designation is something that he is championing, right?
Mhm.
Talk to me a little bit about, from your year there, his insight on why that's important for the Valpo community or Valparaiso community.
Yeah, I think it hits a couple of different points. One is that as you look at our student experience, and when they come here, we're really pushing our students to find their vocational calling and go out and be leaders in society. And oftentimes, when you think about who they interact with when they come to campus among other students, you want to make sure that we're pushing for inclusive excellence and that it is representation from folks from different walks of life. And so I think what the HSI, Hispanic Serving Institution designation does is a couple things. It's a process to help you to make sure that your institution is ready to support students from Latino backgrounds who identify as Hispanic, and I think there's just great benefits in that. And so when we talk about being an inclusive institution, going through that process, I think helps all groups of students because those fundamentals and those are processes help all students. I think that designation and really having that strategy behind being prepared to serve those students and increasing enrollment within that demographic, it is just a great goal that we have. I think it's a great strategy that we have, and we have folks on campus that are committed to doing it.
Yeah, I find that interesting. When I lived in Waco, Texas, I worked on part time on campus at Baylor University for a long time, and there's a woman on campus who's been there for years. Her name is Miss Pearl Beverly. She's in the role of director of multicultural affairs, or she has been in the role of director of multicultural affairs. And one of the things that when I see that see her in that role. She is someone that most of the people, black black people specifically, or just people of color, look up to and have seen and can relate to over that big time span that she's been there. And one of the things she's done or has tried to do through the years is create, or like I always say, create and maintain an environment that people want to be a part of.
Mm.
Because when we come on campus, we specifically black folks, and I imagine this could be the same for people from Latino backgrounds, in order for us to make it from freshman to sophomore year or sophomore to junior year or junior to senior year, we need to feel like we are a part of the community. We need to be comfortable enough to want to come back. So our retention rates continue to grow. And you being in higher education, retention rates is probably one of the big things. So I wonder about that in terms of social work and emphasizing and enhancing a community experience for people of color. Tell me about that aspect of how that ties to athletics. And I think you just mentioned how it ties to where the president wants to take the institution.
Yeah, and so using a kind of a social work framework, we talk a lot about different levels. So at the micro level, you're talking about individuals. At the mezzo level, you're talking about small groups, organizations, and at the macro level, you're talking about institutions and larger communities. And so at the micro level, social workers are interested in well-being and how folks function within their environment. And so we talk about student athletes flourishing and it's this idea, and it comes out of this positive psychology framework that how are they being the best versions of themselves? How are they developing various identities? Whether it's their scholar identity, in our setting, it's an athletic identity, vocational identity. So how are those individuals do they have the support and resources to function at a high level or flourish? We talk about that with their student athletes. I think at the campus level, you're dealing with the same thing. Do students have the tools and the resources to be successful? The other piece of it is when you look at groups, you have two different types of groups. You have groups and communities based on identity, right? And so that may be off of race, ethnicity, that may be off of gender, that may be off of, all these different factors, spirituality, identity, but you also have geographic type communities and groups. And so, how do you bring folks into this system, which is the university? How are you promoting high functioning or flourishing? But a big part of that is sense of community. And so that's when you start getting into this space of retention. That's how you start getting into this space of belongingness. And we're as administrators, we're trying to foster an environment where people can flourish at our institution. And big pieces of that are sense of community. Big pieces of that are community capacity building, right? Like, what is our capacity within the community to meet the needs of those different groups, and those groups being students as one group. Obviously, you have faculty members, you have staff, you have alum that interact, you have the local community, and so that's what I think is fascinating about social work is how are those different demographics and communities flourishing is how I look at it.
Yeah, which I think is very interesting, right? In terms of the work that most people do in college athletics, and really some of them may have not thought about it in terms of social work. You mentioned those three levels: micro, mezzo, and macro.
Yeah.
Right. And so what I understand is micro is kind of on the individual level, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then mezzo would be maybe the subgroups.
Yep. So groups, smaller groups.
Yeah, smaller groups. And then so in terms of in terms of on the campus, Valparaiso, micro would be the individual student athlete, I assume.
Yeah.
Right. Mezzo would be student athletes.
Yep.
Maybe.
Yep.
And then macro would be campus wide, maybe, or
entire
or the department, or
you're right.
Is that
you nailed it?
Okay. And so so you think about college athletics, and I was just something recently informed me of something that I didn't think about, but most athletes are not people of color on a college campus, right? Because most of the athletes are other sports, Olympic sports or non-revenue sports. So, we hear so much about basketball and football and people of color in these sports that people of color participate in, but they're not the majority of the athletes on campus.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you think about these different levels and making sure things are in place so people flourish, I mean, you really have to be in tune to the wide variety of where student athletes and their backgrounds come from and the things that they face. So talk to me a little bit about that from the athletic director lens, and then specifically in the wider campus, because you want these student athletes to fit in with other communities that they can relate to throughout campus.
Yeah, no, I think you framed that question really well, Ty. And so, uh, the way I look at it is, we one of the values within social work is empathy,
Okay.
and so can you really put yourself in different groups of different people's shoes and really understand? And I think it's also this idea of cultural humility, right? This
Okay.
idea of having humility, the self awareness to understand your background in order to help and empower others. So from my seat, when the dynamics that you just kind of described at play, you have revenue generating sports, particularly obviously football and men's basketball, and the populations and the makeup of those sports oftentimes are majority um, people of color, and
Right.
but they're also in interacting on a campus where they may go into a classroom, and every campus is different, but in the context of a predominantly white campus, they're going in a classroom where they may not be the majority from a number standpoint, right? A
Yeah.
number of
That's
people in
sure.
the class. And so when you think about lifespan development and you think about transitions, because all this is at play, you go oftentimes from a space of confidence, a space of dominance, right? Because
Yeah.
you're excelling at a high level in terms of the athletic space, and it's not. And I don't want to overgeneralize,
Yeah.
but at least in the sense of numbers, you're there's more people that don't look like you that do look like
Yeah.
me in that classroom
Yeah. I
setting,
understand.
plus the lifespan development piece of different transitions. Um, and so we need to make sure we have programming systems in place, safe spaces also to have conversations to help people navigate some of those things. Now the other piece of it is you may also have people who are very, very confident in those settings because maybe they're the third generation of family members who are going to college and they've had siblings and they've had parents and uncles and aunts who have navigated that space. So it's having the balance of overall support systems, but also having the flexibility to take an individual approach and understand that every person has a different reality and a different
Mhm.
experience, right? I think the other thing that we have to think about is overall you want to have supports in place, but we also want to account for intersectionality, right? And so oftentimes it's easy to put people in different boxes, but when you think about intersectionality, people come from different walks of life and they have different views. So those relationships become really important because you want to understand from their perspective what they're experiencing and how they're building a sense of community on your
Mhm.
campus.
Yeah. Which is important, right? Because you get into these specific subgroups of people, and you might look at it like that, but then being the person, the leader at 50,000 feet, you also have to look at it. They're all student athletes, right? And they are going to interact, and they are going to have commonalities that cross all these specific subgroups, and you want to make sure uh, they engage with each other in addition to them being, you start going up subgroups, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, these are all the football players, but then they're also student athletes, but then they're also students, right? And so now you just want to make sure that you take the high level or overarching subgroup and mix and mingle as they get into their individual subgroups. One thing
Yeah.
you mentioned
Well,
there,
well, and Ty, just
yeah,
one concept I think is really important is
okay,
you're building culture. So as an athletic director, you're trying to build
hmm
culture within your athletic department. And so how can people be their authentic selves as an individual kind of in this team department type setting? And so, I think that idea of culture humility is really important. Having humility to have the self-awareness, but the openness to want to work with others, have these team goals, and be willing to empower folks from different walks of life. And we talk about this idea of one Valpo. And so
okay,
respecting and seeing people as individuals, but also knowing that we have to come together for these common goals. And so we talk a lot about one Valpo culture humility framework, and a lot of that is embedded in social work.
yeah, which I think is very interesting. One thing you said earlier, I want to ask you about talking about the people of color were mostly football, probably basketball, and some track, I guess. And they may go into, I remember going to finance classes when I was at Michigan State, and it's like, it ain't really a whole lot of brothers in here. But so that's an experience, right? We can relate to. Maybe even you at Pitt, we probably we can relate to, and then you want to make sure that transition, they're understanding how to deal with that transition and the shock from going from where you're confident on the field to where you might not be confident in the classroom because you're the only one. You may know the work, you may be academically excellent, but it's still a different thing. I imagine some of the challenge that people who might not be a person of color maybe even could find, maybe not the same challenge, but maybe they are somebody who's from a country part, a place that's not a city or suburb, and or something like that, and then they go sit down in a room with a bunch of city folks, and they feel like they're kind of isolated too. They know how to be a person of color, but they're still feeling these same challenges. Talk to us about, identifying that. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? You come in and you're a leader, and you can't just focus on people of color. You got to make sure all student athletes feel like they're a part of this community. So tell me about that aspect of what you do
Yeah,
there at
I think
Valpo.
it's an important reminder that we all have multiple identities,
Mm,
and there's times and spaces in life where we're in a area of, whether it's power, privilege, whether it's influence, that kind of ebbs and flows
yeah,
depending on the situation, and depending on the identity and the status that you're in. And so you're right, it's complex, and I think um, at its basic level, once again, I think it comes back to that culture of humility,
yeah,
but also it comes back to, do the student athletes have the support and resources where they can be confident that they're going to be able to have an opportunity to flourish, right? If they
right,
stay disciplined, they put in the work, are they going to have the opportunity in college athletics setting? Are they going to have the opportunity to graduate, right? Are they going
yeah,
to have opportunity
exactly,
to pursue the career of their interest? And then, so as administrators, you're trying to put together kind of these processes in place and these supports, but the flexibility of folks navigating those based on their needs, because people are just come with all types of different needs, and depending on what the need is, you want to direct them to the resource to help them to once again flourish and be successful.
right, and make sure that the environment is safe enough for them to speak when
Exactly.
something is
That's a
probably
great
bothering
point.
them. Hiring coaches and staff, especially from this social work type of mindset, which may not be, the terminology may not be out front when you're interviewing or thinking about or talking about hiring someone, because everybody doesn't have the background, but the understanding cultural humility, understanding the concepts, which seem like they're a part of the institution, may be on the forefront. Talk to me about when you're looking for people to hire coaches. How can you tell if they understand this aspect of the culture at Valpo, or the culture of, in terms of your leadership philosophy, and if that's important to them or not? If they haven't studied social work, without sitting them down and going through a whole academic process of explaining how things work, tell me how you identify those things and make sure it's something that you hire and teach when you bring someone into the culture.
Yeah, you as a leader, you got to have clarity on the type of
Hmm.
culture you're trying to build within the department. Uh, it takes time, but you have to make sure you're reinforcing that when you can on documents and department meetings. Clarity on as a department, what's our recipe for success, right? What's going to help us to be successful? Those common characteristics, and so as you hire folks, you're looking at need and fit the entire time. And I think it's important, if athletics is so fast paced, it's important that you have processes to make sure that you're having those intentional conversations, that you're making sure you're planning on the front end before you engage in the search process. And if you
Right.
do the work on the front end of what are your characteristics of choice for this position, who are we as an institution, who are we as a department, where's the alignment, and then what's the need right
Right.
now. And you have those conversations on the front end, and you want to make sure that you give yourself a chance to have a diverse pool. And if you do all that on the front end, you go hire the best person after that. And
Yeah.
that sounds great conceptually. Is Are you going to be disciplined enough to do it, right, and
Yeah.
execute on that, because it's such a fast pace? I mean, you start talking about hiring coaches,
Yeah.
it's moving so fast. It's pretty public oftentimes, and how do you stay disciplined to that approach and true to that process to get the outcomes that you want?
Yeah. And then also making sure in your mindset, the perspective that you want them to have when they do come on campus, making sure that's, like you mentioned at first, making sure that's well explained out front. You are a candidate, and here are the things how we operate, and we want to see if you fit within the things that operate, or we want to see what you bring to what we do here
And
on campus.
I think the challenging part too is you're pushing your institution, you're trying to get the best person. Well, being open to and making sure you give them space to really reflect on, are they going to be a good fit and do they feel like they're going to be successful? Not do they have a skill set, not do they like the title, not, whatever this was a career goal, but hey, where we're at right now as an institution, as a department, what you're hearing, this is why this is a great place from our eyes, but here are also the challenges. Do you feel like you're going to be successful in a fit? And um like I said, it's easy to say it conceptually, but it's it's
Yeah,
challenge to execute.
it's a big part of the job as an athletics director. I ask a couple questions here, and then we'll wrap. First one is now Valparaiso is a faith-based institution, right? Which introduces a new type of group or subgroup into the campus community. Tell me about that aspect of weaving that through students on campus, but also in college athletics, where people come from a number of different faith, non-faith, religious type backgrounds or spirituality, coming into play sports and be a student there at Valpo.
I agree. Yeah, that's a great question. And as an institution, we have actually we're associated with Lutheran denomination of Christianity, and there's values with that. Um, from one standpoint, I think any student can come to this campus and benefit
Right.
from those values. And it's a lot of this idea of being able to we're developing these leaders and they're going out in society and doing great things. And we have such great students who are also just great people. And and so I'm really proud of being associated with this university, with Valparaiso University, and that background. Uh, but there's also this layer of students can also come from different walks of life, and maybe
Yep.
they they aren't practicing Lutherans, but do you have the values, and are those values going to be aligned where this is going to be a good experience for you? And I think that's the important piece. I think kind of the Lutheran faith and our institution, just our history, has really been about impacting society. And so we have these blessings that are bestowed upon us. We have this vocational calling, and how are you going to add value to others in society? And that may be in engineering, that may be in business, um, and so that's the big takeaway. And I'm excited because I actually think moral education that focuses on those values, can really benefit society. And I think students that come here will have a great experience.
Yeah, that's excellent. I'll ask this last question and we'll wrap. Uh, Specifically about, as you know, NCAA Leadership Development is a sponsor of this podcast. And I know you've been through some programming with the group. I want to ask you, having a unique lens, social work, family, where family of social workers studied it, wanted to bring it to college athletics, thinking about going through the programming and the people that you went through the programming with, how does that lens, like, how does their perception of what people are doing, the success they have found, the programming presented to you, like, how do you use that social work lens to analyze that programming and analyze it to a point where it's benefit for you, but also benefit for other people who you may be mentoring or have become colleagues with throughout your career?
Yes, I've engaged in multiple professional development programs. One of the most impactful ones that I've engaged in is the NCAA's Dr. Charles Whitcomb Leadership Institute. And what I would tell you is it takes you through that process of self-reflection and having clarity on your values and your approach to leadership. And it's an opportunity to really just have that dedicated time for you to reflect on that. And then they bring in these professionals, industry leaders, who are going to challenge you, but also at the same time, it's a nurturing environment where you can grow and evolve. And it's one of the best professional development programs I've been a part of. And within that, you also have communities that are built because you had this shared experience and you were challenged in ways and pushed in ways professionally, maybe that you haven't been pushed before. And to see the group, part of my class, just evolve over time, and you're cheering for folks when you see people get certain positions or have certain accomplishments at their institutions. But then to see the next set of classes continue to have an impact, um, I think at the individual level, it's just, it's so fulfilling to see that. But also think as an industry, the NCAA putting resources towards that, we become stronger as a profession in collegiate athletics. The membership becomes stronger because we're investing in leaders. And so
Right.
I applaud the NCAA. I applaud them for sustaining that programming. And I know for me personally, it was a transformative experience, and I believe in stewardship in terms of my leadership approach. I'm all about stewardship, strategy, and success. And so I always think about, how do I give back? How do I continue to give within our industry, whether it's in a formal way or individually in an informal way? Because I had people pour into me, and the Leadership Institute was one example of that.
Right. Right. Which is excellent. Well, Charles, this has been an excellent conversation. I appreciate you working with me on understanding how social work plays into college athletics in general, but specifically how you do it there at Valparaiso. I really appreciate you joining us here on the One Question Leadership
Well,
Podcast.
Ty, it was a pleasure. I'm a big fan of your podcast. You have so many great topics. I think you should call Michigan State, and if they have
Okay.
a social work program, just play this podcast and see if you can get your foundational classes waived, man. I think you got a grasp on it. You're on your way to an MSW.
Oh man, that's hilarious. I appreciate that. That was Dr. Charles Small. He is the Director of Athletics at Valparaiso University. And of course, I am Ty Brown with one question. And keep in mind, the role of a leader is to create and maintain an environment that people want to be a part of. And as always, be better tomorrow than you are today. This episode of the One Question Leadership Podcast is produced by Spades Media Group, solving problems using creative leadership.